For over 200 years, the skies of Europe were thick with the smoke of burning cities. If you lived in the 9th or 10th century, there was one sight that froze the blood in your veins: the dragon head of a Viking longship breaking through the morning fog. They were the apex predators of the medieval world. They didn't just defeat armies, they obliterated them. They sacked Paris, terrorized the British Isles, and pushed deep into the heart of Russia. No king, no fortress, and no empire could permanently stop the Norse war machine. But what if I told you that at the absolute height of their power, these unstoppable conquerors sailed across the Atlantic, found a virgin paradise, and were utterly humiliated? What if I told you that the fiercest warriors on earth encountered an enemy so terrifying, they packed their ships, fled back across the ocean, and never returned? This is a story that was erased from the history books. A story that happened 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. This is the untold story of the only people in history who successfully broke the Vikings. To understand why the Vikings failed, you have to understand why they left home in the first place. The Vikings weren't just bloodthirsty raiders, they were desperate colonizers. Scandinavia was overpopulated, rocky, and freezing. They needed land. By the year 1000 AD, they had already pushed as far west as Iceland and the brutal, icy coasts of Greenland. But Greenland was a frozen hell. Survival there was a daily, miserable struggle against starvation. So, when a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson heard rumors of a lush, fertile land further to the west, he didn't hesitate. He gathered a crew, braved the lethal North Atlantic, and eventually saw a shoreline that looked like a dream. Endless pine forests, rivers choked with fat salmon, prados of green grass where their cattle could graze forever. They even found wild grapes growing on the vines. Leif called this paradise Vinland. Today we call it Newfoundland, Canada. For the Vikings, this was it. This was the ultimate prize, the New World. They returned to Greenland, gathered a massive colonization fleet, 160 men, women, children, livestock, and heavy iron tools, and sailed back to claim it. They built longhouses, they forged weapons. They prepared to conquer this land just as they had conquered Europe. But there was just one problem. The land was already taken. The Vikings called them the Skraelings. In Old Norse, the word translates roughly to the wretched ones or the ugly ones. It was a name born of pure arrogance. When the Vikings first laid eyes on the indigenous natives of North America, they saw a people they believed were inferior. The Norsemen stood tall in interlocking iron chainmail, gripping heavy, forged steel axes and broadswords. The natives, on the other hand, wore animal pelts. They had no iron, no armor, no horses. They navigated the rivers in canoes made of birch bark, and their weapons were carved from wood and stone. To a Viking warrior who had shattered the armored knights of Europe, these natives looked like easy prey. At first, the two groups cautiously traded. The natives brought rich animal furs, and the Vikings traded them red cloth and milk. It was tense but peaceful, but the Vikings could never suppress their violent nature for long. The ancient Norse sagas aren't entirely clear on what sparked the fire. Maybe a Viking caught a native trying to steal a weapon. Maybe it was a complete misunderstanding. Or maybe it was just the sheer, brutal arrogance of a people used to taking whatever they wanted. Whatever the reason, a Viking drew his blade and murdered one of the natives. The body hit the dirt, and in that single violent moment, the fate of the Norse colonization of America was sealed. The natives didn't scream. They didn't charge. They simply melted backward into the dense, dark forest, vanishing without a trace. The Vikings laughed it off. They tightened their grips on their axes and waited for a fight. But the fight they got was not the one they were prepared for. A few days later, a strange fog rolled down the river. Out of the mist emerged a swarm of canoes, dozens of them moving in absolute silence. The Vikings sounded the alarm. They grabbed their iron shields, locked them together, and formed the legendary shield wall. This was the formation that had crushed armies from England to the Middle East. An impenetrable fortress of wood, leather, and iron. They waited for the natives to charge into their meat grinder. But the natives didn't charge. Instead, the canoes stopped just out of range of the Viking spears. The natives raised their bows. Not the simple weak bows the Vikings were used to, but powerful, complex bows made of wood and animal sinew that could snap an arrow through the air with terrifying force. Suddenly, the sky went dark. A hailstorm of arrows rained down on the Viking settlement. The Vikings huddled behind their shields, listening to the deafening thud of arrows burying themselves into wood and flesh. They were trapped. If they broke the shield wall to charge, they would be slaughtered by arrows, and they couldn't reach the canoes on the water. They were forced to stand there and bleed. After hours of relentless bombardment, the natives disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. The Vikings were battered, confused, and for the first time in generations they felt a cold creep of fear, because they suddenly realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting ghosts. The indigenous warriors, likely the ancestors of the Beothuk or the Mi'kmaq tribes, knew something the Vikings didn't. They knew that you don't beat a heavily armored giant by wrestling him to the ground. You beat him by bleeding him to death from 1,000 tiny cuts. The war shifted from the river to the woods, and in the woods, the Vikings were utterly blind. A Norseman would go to the river to fetch water and never return. A hunting party would step into the tree line, only for their bodies to be found days later, pinned to the earth by arrows. The natives refused to fight in the open. Every tree was a sniper tower. Every bush was an ambush. The heavy iron armor the Vikings wore suddenly became a death trap. It was loud, clunky, and exhausting, making them easy targets for swift, silent hunters who knew every inch of the terrain. But the physical attacks weren't the worst part. It was the psychological warfare. As the weeks dragged on, the natives realized that the Vikings were trapped in their wooden settlement. So they decided to take away the one thing the Norsemen needed to survive: sleep. When the sun went down, the forest would come alive. The natives would surround the Viking camp just outside the light of the torches. They would scream into the darkness. They would bang weapons against the trees. They would imitate the sounds of wild animals and snap heavy branches to make it sound like a massive army was closing in. The Vikings would scramble out of bed, grab their heavy weapons, and run into the cold night air, adrenaline pumping, ready for a fight to the death. But they would find nothing, only the black, empty woods. As soon as they went back to sleep, the screaming would start again. This went on night after night after night. Sleep deprivation is a recognized form of torture. It destroys the mind. It makes you paranoid, irritable, and prone to hallucinations. The Vikings, the conquerors of Europe, began to turn on each other. Morale completely collapsed. The women were terrified. The children were traumatized. One saga tells the story of Freydis Eiriksdottir, a pregnant Viking woman who, during an ambush, grabbed a sword from a fallen man, ripped open her shirt, and beat her chest with the flat of the blade, screaming like a lunatic to scare the natives away. The natives actually retreated, thinking she was completely insane. But the message was terrifyingly clear. If a pregnant, screaming woman is your best line of defense, the war is already over. The Viking leader, Thorfinn Karlsefni, gathered his exhausted, hollow-eyed people. He looked at the lush green grass, the abundant rivers, and the endless timber. It was everything they had ever wanted. It was the key to their future. But it didn't matter. Because none of it mattered if you couldn't close your eyes at night without a knife slipping into the dark. The Vikings realized they could never win. There was no enemy king to execute, no capital city to burn. Just an endless green hell filled with invisible hunters who would never, ever stop. After just 3 years in Vinland, the Vikings gave up. They packed whatever they could fit into their longships, abandoned their houses, and set sail back to the icy, miserable shores of Greenland. They had been defeated, not by superior technology, and not by massive armies. They were defeated by pure, relentless psychological terror. When they returned to Europe, the stories they told were so horrifying that the Norse expansion stopped dead in its tracks. For 500 long years, no European dared to try and colonize the Americas again. The history books loved to talk about the conquests of the Vikings. They loved to paint them as fearless warriors who took what they wanted and feared no man. But history is written by the victors, and the victors in Vinland didn't write sagas. They didn't build monuments to their victory. They simply watched from the shadows of the trees as the dragon ship sailed away in defeat, and then went back to their lives, remaining completely free for half a millennium. The Skraelings did what the combined kings of Europe could not do. They broke the Vikings.